Story 1. A Horrifying Vacation. Next to the cemetery. When I was 10 years old, my family had an almost unshakable tradition. Every summer, we went on vacation with my father's best friend's family. Those trips were usually fun because I could play with the other kids, enjoy the sea breeze, and escape the sweltering city heat. But that particular summer left a mark on me so deep that even now, as an adult, I still can't forget it. What started as an ordinary holiday ended up becoming a memory that haunted me for years afterward. That year, both families had been busy, so no one remembered to book hotel rooms in advance. When we arrived at Puri, a seaside city we often visited, all of our usual hotels were fully booked. We spent nearly the entire afternoon searching for a place to stay and finally found a small hotel set apart from the main road, on a quiet, less traveled street. At first glance, the hotel didn't look bad. The exterior was painted white, with tall trees casting shade over the entrance. But one thing made me shiver the moment I stepped out of the car. Behind the hotel, only a few steps away, lay an old cemetery. The gravestones stood tightly packed, some leaning, some swallowed by weeds. The air there felt heavy, isolated, as if cut off from the lively world beyond. I wanted to tell my parents that I didn't like this place, but seeing how tired everyone was, I stayed silent. We were given 2 adjacent rooms on the second floor. My room was the one farther inside, its window facing directly toward the cemetery. The room itself was clean enough, but carried a strange, musty smell, like it hadn't been occupied for a long time. That night, after a long, exhausting day, everyone quickly fell asleep. I shared a single bed with my mother. At first, I slept soundly, but sometime around midnight, I suddenly woke up. The strange thing was, I couldn't move. My whole body was frozen stiff, as though something invisible was pressing down on my chest. My breathing became shallow and rapid. My eyes darted around, searching for my mother, wanting to call for help, but my mouth couldn't form a sound. And then, in my panic, my gaze landed on the corner of the room, near the curtain. Someone was standing there. The dim light filtering through the window was just enough to outline a slender figure, with long hair falling over half of her face. She stood motionless, silent, watching. I tried to convince myself I was dreaming, but the pressure on my chest felt too real. Slowly, the figure took a step forward. The floorboards creaked audibly. Terror flooded me, and tears streamed down my cheeks, but my body remained paralyzed, as though bound by invisible ropes. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was only an illusion. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually I slipped into unconsciousness from exhaustion. The next morning, I woke with a strange, heavy fatigue. I had planned to tell my mother about what I'd seen, but before I could, she looked at me with a tense, pale face. She lowered her voice, speaking just loud enough for me to hear. "Did you see anything last night?" My heart pounded. Trembling, I told her about the paralysis, the inability to move, and the person I saw standing in the corner of the room. As I spoke, her face drained of color. She stayed silent for a few seconds, then whispered, "I saw it too. I woke up at midnight, and I swear there was a woman with long hair standing right there in the corner." We stared at each other, fear reflected in both our eyes. We had planned to stay there for a few more days, but after that night, my mother insisted on changing hotels immediately. Though it was difficult, my father managed to find another place far from the cemetery, and the rest of the trip went on as normal. But for me, everything had changed. Each night, I dreamed of that old room, the dream replaying over and over, the silent figure standing in the corner, long black hair covering her face. Even now, as an adult, I can't explain what happened that night. Was it simply sleep paralysis? Or was there truly a wandering spirit in that room, coming from the cemetery next door? What chills me most is my mother's confirmation. If it had only been me, I might have dismissed it as a dream. But when my mother also saw the exact same figure, there was no reason left to deny it. And since that trip, I have never, ever stayed at any hotel located near a cemetery again. Story 2, the neighbor standing at the door. For most of my life, I lived in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place where everyone had known each other for years, where people greeted one another on morning walks, and where doors were often left unlocked because there was a strong sense of trust. I grew up in my childhood home, and even after my parents moved away, I stayed there. The house wasn't large, but it carried too many memories for me to abandon it. For a long time, my life remained stable and peaceful, until one particular autumn. That was when a new man moved into the house across the street. At first, he seemed ordinary enough. Middle-aged, average build, always wearing plain clothes, dark jeans, button-up shirts, sometimes a cap. Nothing about him immediately stood out. He didn't interact much with the neighbors, but that wasn't unusual. Some people simply liked their privacy. But something about him unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way he always seemed to be outside at odd hours, sometimes standing in his yard at 3 a.m., just staring up at the sky. Or maybe it was his eyes. Whenever I happened to glance his way, I would find his gaze fixed on me, cold, unblinking, like he wasn't looking at me, but through me. One evening, I was watching TV when I heard the faint creak of my front porch steps. At first, I thought it was a stray cat, but when I muted the volume, the sound was too deliberate. Measured footsteps. Cautiously, I walked toward the front door. Without turning on the porch light, I peeked through the peephole. My stomach dropped. The man from across the street was standing on my porch. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't saying anything. He just stood there, his face tilted slightly downward, as if listening. I froze, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I waited, expecting him to leave after a few seconds. But he didn't. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, at least 10 minutes, before finally turning and walking back across the street. That night, I barely slept. Over the next few weeks, it became a recurring pattern. Every few nights, usually past midnight, I would hear my porch creak again. And every time, when I looked, he was there, standing silently facing my door, as though waiting for me to open it. I never did. I tried to tell myself he might just be drunk or confused or maybe even sleepwalking. But deep down, I knew better. The way he stood, so still, so deliberate, it wasn't the behavior of someone lost in a daze. It was purposeful. He wanted me to know he was there. One night, things escalated. It was 2 a.m. when I woke to the faintest tapping sound. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from my bedroom window. Slowly, with dread flooding my chest, I turned toward the blinds. A dark silhouette was pressed against the glass. The man. His face was inches away from the window, his breath fogging the glass. He wasn't moving, not even blinking, just staring straight in. I wanted to scream, but terror locked my throat. I scrambled for my phone and dialed the police with shaking hands. By the time the officers arrived, he was gone. They checked the yard, the porch, the street. Nothing. They told me it was probably just a misunderstanding and suggested I install cameras if I was worried. So I did. I set up a motion-activated camera pointing at my porch. The very next night, I heard the familiar creak of the steps. Heart pounding, I stayed in bed, letting the camera do its job. The next morning, I checked the footage. There he was, standing at my door, not moving, not knocking, just watching. The recording showed him staying there for nearly 20 minutes. At one point, He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the door, as if trying to hear inside. Then, chillingly, he raised his hand and slowly traced the outline of the door frame with his finger, like he was memorizing it. I immediately brought the footage to the police. But again, they claimed there wasn't much they could do unless he actually tried to break in. The nightmare continued for weeks. Sometimes he would be on the porch, sometimes by the window. Once, I even spotted him standing across the street in his yard, facing my house for hours, perfectly motionless, as though he were a statue. I became paranoid, barely sleeping, double-checking all the locks, keeping lights on through the night. I considered moving, but this was my home. Why should I be the one to leave? But deep down, I knew something was coming. One evening, after work, I returned home to find something that froze my blood. The front door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it that morning. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open, half expecting to see him inside. The living room looked untouched, the kitchen too. I searched every room, my heart ready to burst. Nothing. But when I reached my bedroom, I noticed something on my nightstand, a small object that definitely hadn't been there before. It was a single key, old, rusted, unfamiliar, and next to it, a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. It read, "Soon." That was the breaking point. I left that house that very night, taking only a bag of essentials. I stayed with a friend across town and reported everything to the police once again, showing them the key and the note. The very next day, when officers went to question the man across the street, they found the house completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. It was as if he had never existed. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. A stalker? A drifter? Something worse? But sometimes late at night, when I hear a floorboard creak or a soft tap against the window, I remember his face, expressionless, waiting, always watching. And I wonder, will he ever come back? Story 3. The Man in the Basement. A few years ago, I moved to a new city. To be more specific, it was the outskirts of the city, a place that felt more like a quiet small town than a bustling urban neighborhood. Houses were spaced far apart, the streets were lined with trees, and the nights were so still that you could hear your own heartbeat in the silence. The house I bought wasn't big, but it was cozy and affordable. I figured it was the perfect place to settle down, far away from the constant noise and chaos I had grown up with. At first, everything seemed fine, peaceful, safe, but not long after I moved in, I began to sense something wrong. It started with sounds. Late at night, when I was in bed reading or drifting to sleep, I'd hear faint noises coming from the basement. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Old houses creak, pipes groan, wood expands and contracts with the weather. That's all it was, right? But the noises became more distinct. Not random creaks, not plumbing, footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving back and forth in the basement directly beneath my bedroom floor. I remember lying frozen in bed, straining to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the sound was too real, too rhythmic. Someone or something was down there. The next morning, I gathered enough courage to check. I unlocked the basement door, flipped the light switch, and descended the narrow wooden stairs. The air down there was cold and damp, carrying the smell of mold and earth. The concrete floor was cracked in places and cobwebs clung to the corners. I searched every inch, the storage shelves, the utility area, even behind the old furnace. Nothing. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I was just nervous about living alone in a new place. But that night, the footsteps returned. Louder, closer. One evening, I decided to test it. When I heard the footsteps begin, I walked softly to the basement door and pressed my ear against it. For several seconds, there was silence, as though whoever or whatever was down there had paused, listening for me. Then, suddenly, a loud thud shook the door, making me jump back in terror. It was as if something had slammed against the other side deliberately. I didn't sleep at all that night. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That there were footsteps in my basement I couldn't prove? They'd laugh me out of the station. So I kept enduring it, night after night. The noises grew bolder. Sometimes it wasn't just footsteps anymore. I could hear faint whispering, too soft to make out words, but clear enough that I knew it wasn't just the house settling. And then came the worst night. It was around 3 a.m. when I awoke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I froze in bed, every nerve in my body screaming in panic. Slowly, I turned my head toward the doorway. In the faint glow of the streetlight outside, I saw a shadow, tall, human-shaped, standing completely still in the doorway, watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to grab my phone, to run, to do something, but my body was paralyzed with fear. After what felt like hours, but could have only been seconds, the figure slowly stepped backward into the hallway and disappeared. The next morning, I found the basement door wide open. That was the breaking point. I called the police. 2 officers arrived, searched the house top to bottom, including the basement. They found no intruder, no forced entry, nothing unusual. But one of the officers pulled me aside and asked, almost hesitantly, "Are you sure this house was completely empty when you moved in?" Confused, I said yes. He glanced back toward the basement and muttered, "Because there are signs someone's been living down there." My stomach dropped. When I asked what he meant, he pointed out subtle things I had missed. A blanket stuffed behind the furnace, empty food wrappers shoved into a corner, and faint footprints in the dust across the floor. The police couldn't explain how someone had been coming and going without being seen, but they advised me to stay somewhere else until they investigated further. I spent that night at a hotel. The following day, when officers returned to check the basement again, they found something chilling. Hidden behind a false wall panel in the far corner of the basement was a small crawl space. Inside were more food wrappers, a lantern, a small notebook filled with scribbled handwriting, and a pile of old, rusted tools. The notebook contained drawings, pages and pages of crude sketches, and nearly all of them were of me. Me walking to my car, me cooking in the kitchen, me sleeping in my bed. That was enough. I moved out immediately. The police never found the man who had been living in my basement. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only his disturbing collection of notes and drawings. Even now, years later, I can't sleep without double-checking every lock, every window, every door. And sometimes, in the dead silence of the night, I still imagine I hear it, the faint creak of footsteps moving beneath my floor.